We have some unfinished business. I'm James Sebenius, and I'll be moderating the upcoming session focused on Aceh, plus some of the questions you'll ask more broadly. But it's my great pleasure now to move to the ceremonial piece of our day before we revert to substance. And Nick is my co-chair this time, and Bob as the chair of the program on negotiation, collectively are very pleased to honor President Ahtisaari with the Great Negotiator Award this year. As I think about halfway in our sessions, he has given us a lot to think about as what a great negotiator entails. And it's not all comfortable given standard preconceptions. He has absolute clarity on objectives, no open-ended processes for him. And even at the cost of potential blockers, even at the cost of so-called impartiality, absolute clarity on objectives. He's not a solo operator, not a lone ranger. It's the team is critical. And not just the skills of an individual team, but the networks they embody, linked to the networks that he embodies, as much as solo skills. There are many other things I suspect we'll be able to add from the conversation we'll soon have on Aceh and more broadly from your questions. But as a great negotiator, you've given us a lot to think about. Bob?
We're thrilled that you are our 2010 Great Negotiator. I hope you agree that you're in good company. On the back of our program are your predecessors, and I'm sure they would all be proud to be in your company. Nick?
Good. Well, let's get to the point of actually giving this award to the president. So I just want to say very briefly, the Kennedy School is very proud to join the Law School and Business School this year as a co-sponsor. We do try to teach our students that modern-day diplomats are not just always objective mediators. As Bob said, they're people with a point of view and a passion. As someone who worked as an American diplomat during the Kosovo talks, we wouldn't have had justice served and Kosovo independent had it not been for the credibility of the path that President Ahtisaari put these negotiations on in late 2005. He is the single man in the international community who deserves the greatest credit and therefore a truly great negotiator. Martti, this is very heavy.
Thank you so much.
Can I say something?
Yeah. We'll ship it to you.
May I use the opportunity now to thank you all for this honor. My colleagues are very angry what I'm going to say now, but I can't help. I think we have to enlighten the audience for a little bit, so allow me to tell a story. Every time I'm introduced somewhere, it's a different story. One of the most intriguing ones was a couple of years ago in London. I got an honorary doctorate from UCL. And when the evening came and dinner, we were all honorary doctors introduced. When the master of ceremony came to me, and I stood up there to listen what he had to say, he started by saying that I was in pains to try to think how I would introduce Mr. Ahtisaari. But finally I got it. He's a David Beckham of diplomacy. Now, I'm very fond of football. But when the evening was over and I went to thank the master of ceremonies, and I said, you didn't actually realize how appropriate this comparison was when you compared me to David Beckham, because David and I have the same problem. How to find a way to retire gracefully. So here we are. I'm still trying, and I see that David is trying that as well. I have never met him, but I have decided that one way or another I have to get hold of him and say hello. Thank you very much. This, I know already a place in my office where I want this to be placed. It has been a pleasure to be here, and I hope that we have a good discussion as we had earlier today. Thank you.
As Nick did when we began the Kosovo discussion, we decided it might be useful to spend 4 or 5 minutes just framing the situation when President Ahtisaari began his active role in Aceh. It looks like two parties, but in a very rough way. You'll see the government of Indonesia, the Free Aceh movement, the government, of course, with the executive branch, parliament, and the Indonesian military cross-cutting in important ways. The negotiators for the Indonesian government. You have the exiled leadership of the Free Aceh movement, their negotiators, with a series of links this way. President Ahtisaari and his CMI team, Juha Christensen, the businessman who recruited him into the effort, had spoke Bahasa and other dialects. A Finnish military expert, Jaakko Oksanen, who turns out to be key in this. Our focus will be in this circle, but it's a much wider negotiation with many fronts, in particular around the issue of monitoring with the EU and the ASEAN nations, all of whom were key here. So this is a quick cut at what sometimes people think is two parties, and within each of these, naturally much more complexity. Where we want to leave this, as we turn it over to President Ahtisaari, is with the benefit of some outside observers and background work we've done, looking at some of the barriers that faced involvement in this. A history of violence, human rights abuse, lack of credibility, and a pessimism given the failed negotiations that seemingly had made things worse. Potential spoilers, not only the Indonesian military, GAM field commanders, the leadership in exile. Conflicting positions and interests on a number of issues in this negotiation. So the nature of the talks themselves, the Indonesian government seeking comprehensive talks on everything versus GAM, which said, no, let's do a ceasefire and then let's talk more broadly. The political status of Aceh. The government of Indonesia was willing to talk and flesh out autonomy, secretly and for years, and as burst out in the negotiations, the GAM negotiators really wanted independence. If there was less than full independence, the question of political parties. The government of Indonesia said they must be national, but how, said the GAM negotiators, if we didn't have local parties to represent our interests, how could this be a meaningful possibility? Lots of other things, decommissioning of weapons, civilian reintegration, the role of the military post-deal, who owned the abundant natural resources, some 30% of Indonesia's oil and gas reserves, as well as a critical one, monitoring. GAM initially said, we want a large armed international force, UN, EU, whoever, but a lot of people to monitor this, versus the Indonesian government with a sense that no internationalization of this conflict should take place. It's an internal affair of Indonesia, and somehow this circle would need to be squared. Securing any deal would require some kind of monitoring, which no one had agreed to early on. And coming into this, as a former Finnish president with a great number of other conflicts in which he played a key role, no formal power to reward, to sanction. And so these would be, I think, a set of barriers to be overcome if success were to be put in place. So I think we could list more, and in fact, this is a pared down list. But as we start the discussion among my two colleagues who I would like to introduce to you now, Iris Bonet, who teaches at the Kennedy School, Brian Mandel, who does as well, both experts in negotiation. The three of us will be going back and forth for a while with President Ahtisaari on some of these issues. Where I'd like to start, if I could, is how, if these seemed like the major barriers, and if so, which of them were most important, and how did you plan or hope to deal with that?
Of course, the first thing I have to explain that the first contact that I had with the official of the Indonesian government was in February, when Juha Christensen and Dr. Farid Hussein came to Helsinki. I was actually approached by the editor of the magazine where Katri Merikalli, who is here, who has written a book about Aceh, lady over there, he called me and said that he knows Juha Christensen and would I be prepared to receive him and Dr. Farid Hussein on coming Sunday afternoon. I said, yes, you are welcome. I will give you a cup of coffee or tea. So they came, and I listened, because they had been in Stockholm and they had actually not been able to see anybody there, despite the expectations. Kam refused to see Dr. Farid Hussein. So my basic message listening to them was, in the end of that day, that Dr. Farid Hussein, go home and start thinking, what is it that your government is prepared to offer that might make Free Aceh movement interested? And that's it. We departed, had a very pleasant afternoon, and then I heard nothing except 2 days before Christmas I was approached by Juha Christensen, who said that if you would help to mediate this issue, the parties are prepared to come to Helsinki. I said, before I say anything, I want to see the people who are from Free Aceh movement come, who are living in Stockholm, because the top leadership was there. Mr. Malik Mahmoud was their so-called president with that title. He had not yet got a political asylum in Stockholm, so he couldn't come. When I asked him to come to Finland before we would start negotiations, he couldn't come because otherwise he would have landed in Finland. So I asked the so-called foreign minister to come, and there was a man who dealt with information. They came. Both of them spoke good Swedish, so I was always joking that I'm negotiating with the Swedes. But I told them what the score was. I know that you were wanting to have independence, but Indonesian government is offering you special autonomy. I know it's not what you want, but I don't see why you shouldn't come to Helsinki and listen what the government have to say. And we can jointly probe what that special autonomy means in practice. And there's nothing for you to lose. If you don't like what the government says, go to Sweden and you can stay the rest of your days there. And I go and do something more useful. But if I were you, I don't see anything what I would lose if I would listen to. There's a new government who seems to be wanting to have a peaceful settlement of the conflict. So we got few hours before my deadline ended, they said yes, they are coming. So that was perhaps the most important issue again, that I had to clarify that we were only going to speak about special autonomy, and made it perfectly clear that that was the only topic on the agenda.
During the break, 2 students asked me questions to ask of President Ahtisaari, and I'd like to do that because I think they're good ones on which for us to close a formal part of what we're doing. Here are the 2 questions, if I might ask them. The first has to do with looking back over Kosovo and Aceh, things that in retrospect you would have done differently in your role, and why. The second question is for the very large number of people in this room as students or colleagues of others in the room who aspire to become effective negotiators, mediators, whatever role you choose to call it. What are some, in your looking back over experience, what are some key characteristics, and how best can people equip themselves in their career to become effective?
No, the first question, would I have done something differently? I don't think I give too much thought about. When I finish my work, it's done, and I start a new one. I think you have to give also more perspective to before you can see what we could have added. But first of all, every case that I have been involved is a sui generis in the sense that you can't transfer it and say that I did it there and then it has to be done in a similar fashion in the next round. It doesn't work that way. Every case is a sui generis. Special case, I think you have to try to study it as well as you can, as fast as possible. So I don't think so. I think we did what we had to do, and in both cases, and there will be minor details here and there, but not on the main line. And it's not that I'm pompously saying that I'm so marvelous, but I can't think of in these two cases, and which were the real negotiation cases that we could have done anything differently.
But you did learn a lot from what had happened before. Looking at the Swiss efforts at the humanitarian pause
Yes.
and Koha, and the proposal, for example, for a ceasefire, which you said, it sounds good, but it'll be unmonitorable and won't achieve anything.
No, but
So
that-
learning from history, not what you did,
No, but that-
really mattered.
Yes, but that's why if you want to become first of all, it's by chance that you have a career like myself. Had I not joined first of all Foreign Service in 1965 in the development side, I ended up running the Finnish aid program in Foreign Service. Had I not become ambassador to Tanzania in 1973, had I not been dealing with the humanitarian assistance to liberation movements and been on the Senate of UN Institute in Namibia, I would never have become the UN Commissioner for Namibia. Had I been ambassador in India, my career would have been totally different. So I hope that you do well with your studies, first of all. I tell my colleagues very often that I hope that you have enough understanding of economics, because if you don't understand how the economics functions, because economics have a lot to do with the problems that... So I think you have to understand if you want to approach, and I think you have to be absolutely honest in analyzing the problems. There you can't take any sides in your mind when you start looking at the situation. Even if you would have your friends and your sympathy might be on the other side, but you have to look very harsh on them. No favors to anybody. You have to be able to do that, because otherwise you lose your credibility. So you have to be able to be criticized, and criticized hard. And as long as you know that you are doing the right thing, I can't give you any other. You have to decide what the right thing in every situation is. But and you have to be able to live with that, what you say is right. Then I welcome you to this business.
I'm glad you took that question. There are lots of others on Kashmir, on how we solve the Israelis and Palestinians, Mexican drug cartels. I suspect we could go a lot further. That conversation doesn't stop, but the formal public piece of it does. We invite you here. We invite you to the reception. Most of all, we want to thank President Ahtisaari.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.